Kia ora team, welcome to the second round of content for our third block before exam 3. So last week we looked at the nervous system in the brain, our major communication system, and then this week we're going to look at our second communication system, which is the endocrine system. Learning outcomes for this week is to define what a hormone is and target organs, describe how hormones bring about their effects in the body. Within that we will also learn about some structure of key endocrine glands and linking this to some key examples of homeostasis. So if we just summarize the endocrine system, it's the second control system of the body. The endocrine system releases chemicals. Those chemicals are called hormones, and they regulate pretty complex body processes, but all to do with helping us run our system and maintain balance, that is homeostasis. How this is done is hormones are released by our endocrine glands, and these chemical messages travel through our blood and they alter the activity of a target cell. So they either increase the function of that target cell or they might decrease the function of that target cell, depending on the situation. And it does this all because of homeostasis. It's a complex system, and it regulates things like growth and development, metabolism, so how quick chemical reactions happen within our body, and reproduction. Endo, that word means within, and crine means to secrete. So endocrine glands secrete chemical messages within the body. Endocrinology, so any kind of word that has the suffix ology means the study of something. Endocrinology is the study of endocrine organs and the hormones that they produce. It's our second messenger system, uses chemical messages, works with the nervous system to direct and coordinate cells, maintain homeostasis. A little bit of repetition there. I guess it's just to highlight the importance of the structures that send these messages and that it's all about maintaining our homeostasis. Your hormones control and regulate these different things, so reproduction, metabolism and energy balance, growth and development, body defenses, general homeostasis, water, nutrient and electrolyte balance of the blood. So some of these we will actually touch on next week. So reproduction and some of this water and nutrient and electrolyte balance we will talk about next week when we look at the urinary system and the reproductive system. So let's look at what hormones are. The Greek word meaning to arouse or to excite, which they do, but they can also make you relax or chill out. So they trigger target organs to either increase function or decrease the function. Chemical messages produced and secreted into the bloodstream. So our nervous system uses a series of neurons and those supporting glial cells to send electrical messages, whereas our endocrine system uses our cardiovascular system, which remember is its function is transport, the blood train to transport these chemical messages around our body. Hormones are slower to take effect, but the effects last longer than that of an action potential. So a nervous system can send a message really quickly, and it can have a pretty quick, it can take effect really fast, but it can also be shut off really fast. Whereas hormones are slower to be released, slower to take effect, but the effect will also last longer and can potentially take longer to switch off. So this diagram just shows on the left hand side here a secreting endocrine gland secreting an hormone, so it's leaving the cell membrane and then enters into the blood, and that's what that green stuff is, traveling through the blood, and it hits a target organ. Endocrine structures, so a gland is any structure that makes and secretes a hormone. This diagram, be familiar with this and the organs on here. These are the endocrine glands that you'll need to be able to identify and label on this diagram, and we're going to talk about all of these different glands and what they do, minus the reproductive organs, which we'll talk a bit more next week. Now, this is quite a key concept to understand. Hormones and target organs work like a lock and key relationship. So a hormone can only trigger a reaction in a specific or its target cell. I will say target cells and target organs interchangeably. So remember, cells make tissues that make an organ. So by saying cells and organs is a similar thing. If you think about a door that is locked with a key, it's only able to be opened by the key that is designed for that lock. So a hormone alters the activity of the target cell by either increasing or decreasing some of its functions. This means that a hormone has receptors on its surface, just like the target cell will have, that connect, just like a lock and key situation. Okay, so we're going to look at two different types of hormones and how they're made. Just a bit of info before we kick this off. Remember that a cell membrane is made up of a double layer of fats called phospholipids, and the outsides of those two phospholipids that line up like this to make a cell membrane are attracted to water, and the insides repel water. So an amino acid based hormone is made from amino acids, so it's made from proteins, and it's water soluble. This means that it cannot enter through a cell membrane, because a cell membrane is made of fats. So because it's water soluble and not fat soluble, the hormone has to bind with specific receptors on the target cell's membrane. This triggers a second messenger within that cell membrane to then move inside the cell and cause a rapid effect. Whereas our steroid-based hormones are made of cholesterol or fats, so it means that they can actually easily diffuse straight through a cell membrane into the nucleus of that cell and trigger an effect directly. Here's a bit of a diagram of what we're talking about. So amino acid based hormones, you've got this triangle represents a non-steroid hormone, so some kind of amino acid based hormone. It binds with the receptor in the cell membrane, so it's that rectangle with a triangle space that's available, so that's the receptor, and then that triggers the fortune cookie looking thing to then the second messenger to then move into the cell. So that fortune cookie looking thing is a part of the cell membrane already. Once the hormone triggers the first receptor, it then releases the second messenger into the cell, and then that triggers a response within the cell. The steroid-based hormone is represented by that banana-looking thing. It's fat-soluble, so it's made of cholesterol lipids. It can diffuse directly through that cell membrane, and it will actually move right into the nucleus of the cell to create its function. So in this example, it's a hormone that has triggered protein synthesis. How are these hormones released? So how is our body triggered to release these hormones? So we've got hormonal stimulus, where endocrine organs are stimulated to secrete their hormone by other hormones. This is called a cascade of hormones, where one organ will release a hormone, and the target organ for that hormone will be another endocrine gland to secrete more hormones, almost like a cascade or like a waterfall. Humoral stimulus is when endocrine organs are stimulated to secrete their hormone by changing nutrient levels within blood. So your hypothalamus, for example, detects changes in blood pH, and this can trigger a release of hormones. A good example of this is sodium and potassium, which we've just been talking about last week in the nervous system. So concentrations of that in our blood can trigger humoral response. A neural stimulus is another way. So endocrine glands can be stimulated to secrete their hormone via a nerve impulse or an action potential. So we've got hormones triggering hormones, we've got changes in the condition of blood triggering hormone release, and then we've got a neural stimulus. Here's an example in terms of diagram of both. Hormonal stimulus, where the hypothalamus has released hormones that then trigger the anterior pituitary gland to secrete hormones that trigger the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland, cortex, or reproductive organs. Humoral stimulus, so we've got a change in the concentration of calcium within the blood, and that triggers our parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone, which helps regulate blood calcium levels by either breaking down or building up bone material. And then we have the neural stimulus. So here's an example of a nerve impulse being sent from the spinal cord, from our central nervous system, to the adrenal glands that sit on top of our kidneys. So if we think about that, that's part of the response that triggers our sympathetic nervous system, or our stress nervous system. Okay, now we're going to look at some of these different organs and what they release, and some of the functions of the hormones that they release. And these are all organs that are in the diagram that you'll need to be able to recognize and label. So the hypothalamus is the hub of where the nervous and endocrine systems meet. It keeps tabs on what's going on throughout the body, does this through things like monitoring different pH and concentrations of various substances within your blood. Action potentials or nerve impulses in the brain trigger neurons in the hypothalamus to release hormones. So the neurons at the hypothalamus trigger the target cells of the hypothalamus to release hormones, and this causes a cascade. So the hypothalamus releases hormones that trigger other glands to release more hormones. So their target organs are going to be other endocrine glands. The pituitary gland, it's the master gland. It's found deep within the brain. It's inferior to the hypothalamus, so it sits just below. It's a hormone release is often controlled by the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, which is linked to the nervous system, sort of directs what that pituitary gland does. And we've got the anterior, so the front, and the posterior lobes of the pituitary gland. So if we look at the front lobe, this secretes these different organs, so hormones, so quite a lot. Growth hormone acts on most tissues, responsible for growth and development. Prolactin, so lactin sounds like lactate, so acts on the mammary glands, growth and milk production. A thyroid stimulating hormone, so that acts on the thyroid and it increases thyroid hormone secretion. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, acts on our adrenal cortex, which is our adrenal glands, which we'll look at soon. Increases glucocorticoid hormone secretion, so that's got something to do with glucose, because you've got the word gluco there. Luteinizing hormone, which acts on ovaries, triggering ovulation, so that's to do with the menstrual cycle in females. So you can see from the brain, starting with the hypothalamus, that can trigger a lot of processes that are pretty crucial to our survival and daily function and maintaining homeostasis. Here's the anterior lobe in a diagrammatic format. So we got the hypothalamus, the front of the pituitary gland, and then those same different hormones that trigger each of these different target cells. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So this acts on the kidneys to increase concentration of urine, preserve O2 in the body, so water, less water loss. We will look at this more next week when we look at the urinary system. Oxytocin is an important hormone for childbirth, so it acts on muscles like the uterus and the mammary glands, so it can, once triggered during labor, it increases the intensity of contraction until a baby is born, but it's also important for breastfeeding, so the stimulating mammary glands to release milk. Pineal gland, which is also found in the brain, found deep in the brain, slightly to the back, so posterior, secretes melatonin. I think of tonin, sounds like tonight, and I say that because it peaks at night time and it makes us feel drowsy. So this is the hormone that helps us to relax and fall to sleep. So it's, it makes sense that it's lowest during the day or midday. It controls circadian rhythm and internal body clock. So that's why like shift working and traveling and going through different time zones not being stimulated by natural light can affect melatonin release, or why artificial light late at night can potentially hinder or inhibit some of this kind of release of melatonin and can affect how we sleep at night. This clock's pretty cool. It just shows sort of how alert we are during the day, when our temperature is highest and lowest, when melatonin is secreted. So you can see it's secreted later in the evening or afternoon, and then cortisol, which is like the opposite, which triggers us to wake up and to be a bit more active and higher alert. See, we're higher alert in the morning. However, we got fastest reaction times and best coordination in the afternoon, potentially. Here we've got the thyroid gland. This diagram just shows the neck, the trachea, and the larynx just above, and the thyroid is wrapped around the trachea. So it's located in the neck anterior to the trachea and produces thyroid hormone, which controls metabolism. So things like our basal metabolic rate. So issues with thyroid hormone or the thyroid gland can affect your ability to metabolize food and how much energy that you burn. And then calcitonin, you can imagine that it has something to do with calcium. It decreases blood calcium levels by depositing or triggering the deposits of calcium into bone. Our parathyroid glands, so these are 4 little like yellow bean looking organs, endocrine organs that sit on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, and they produce parathyroid hormone or PTH, and they do the opposite of calcitonin. They increase blood calcium levels, so they break down bone. And here we have the homeostatic process of maintaining balance in terms of blood calcium levels. Okay, so if blood calcium levels go up, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin then triggers that excess calcium in our blood to be deposited in our skeleton or in our bones, and that brings us back down to level. If those calcium levels start to drop, then the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. They trigger the breakdown of bone. So if we think about our bone cells, the osteoclasts, which break down bone, to be deposited into blood to help regulate our blood calcium levels. So you can see how if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, then potentially your body will have to break down what you already have stored to help maintain blood calcium levels. The thymus, which we looked at in the immune system, so we'll only just touch on this, but there's some stuff we didn't talk about in the immune system that's interesting. So when we're born as children, it's the biggest. It's made of immune tissue that releases thymosin and thymopoietin hormones, and they are essential for the development and training of our T cells in our immune system, which we know. So that supports our immune system. What's interesting is as we get older and into the elderly age bracket, the thymus becomes adipose tissue or fat tissue and pretty much becomes dysfunctional. So if you think about that, as a kid, we have a developing immune system, so it's very active. As we become older and more mature and we have a mature immune system, the function of it is not necessarily needed as often. So it starts to break, or it starts to change its structure and becomes less active. Our adrenal glands, think of those as little hats that sit on top of our kidneys, small glands lying on top of the kidneys. Each adrenal gland has 2 parts, the medulla, which is the middle or the inside, and the cortex, which is the outside. And each of these have a different function. So you should be able to see this diagram and be able to tell me that the cortex is the outside layer and the medulla is the inside layer. And they sit on top of the kidneys. The kidneys aren't endocrine glands, but they have endocrine gland top hats. The medulla, or the inside, releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. They prepare the body physiologically for emergencies, so that's stimulating our sympathetic nervous system. So increase in heart rate, muscle tone, constriction and dilation of blood vessels, so helping control where blood flow goes. And then we have the cortex, which is the outside. So primary stress hormone increases glucose into our blood, increases the use of glucose by the brain. That's the one that helps us wake up. And then aldosterone helps regulate blood pressure, blood volume, water retention, and water loss. And we'll talk about aldosterone next week when we look at the kidneys and the urinary system. Pancreas is a sweet organ that is involved in assisting the uptake and breakdown of glucose. So it has specialized beta cells and alpha cells that make up the pancreas. Your beta cells produce insulin, and insulin helps to decrease blood glucose levels. So if you've got high level of glucose in your blood, insulin is released and it tells your body to use that glucose, so tell cells that need it to use it, but also to store insulin and sugar in the form of glycogen in your muscles and liver, but also potentially store it long term if you need to. And then on the flip side, we have alpha cells which produce glucagon, a hormone that triggers the breakdown or increase in blood glucose. So I think of it as glucagon. So if you're fasting or haven't eaten food for a while, your pancreas will release glucagon, and that will trigger the breakdown of stored glucose. So we've got stored glucose in the form of glycogen. So that will help restore blood glucose levels pretty quickly. And this is happening on and off all the time, based around what we're eating and when we're not eating. And then diabetes, so type 1 diabetes, is when our beta cells have been damaged by our own immune system and we cannot produce insulin at all. So we need to artificially regulate insulin ourselves through injection and monitoring blood glucose levels. Type 2 diabetes is when we produce insulin, but our body is less respondent to it. So we've decreased our responsiveness to glucose. So we need to manage how much insulin we need or how sensitive we are to it through the foods that we eat, and it's brought on by a constant supply of high sugary diets. And here's a bit of a process of what's happening. So blood glucose levels go up, pancreas secretes insulin that triggers the uptake of glucose into the liver as glycogen. It also stimulates the uptake of glucose from your body's tissue cells, so it might be working muscles. And then blood glucose levels start to drop again. If they drop too far because we haven't eaten for a while, then the pancreas is triggered to release glucagon. That stimulates the breakdown of that stored glycogen that we have in our livers, and that increases our blood glucose levels. Okay, that brings us to the end, team. We've touched on the structure. We've looked at some processes of what each hormone does in the body. There are so many more, but we've just stuck with what we see in the diagram, plus the reproductive and urinary stuff we will save for next week. So don't panic, trust the process, stay on top of the Quizlet stuff and the resources in Moodle, and don't forget your online quiz. Cheers.